Well, welcome to my webinar, Addressing Parental Alienation at a Micro and Macro Level, the Need for a Multifaceted Approach. I'd like to thank Elaine Cobb and the folks at Family Access for Children's Rights for organizing this important international event. I'm honored to be here with you today, and I'm honored that you've joined me to explore what's an extremely complex social problem that affects the lives of so many Americans and people around the globe. Parental alienation is a global problem that has had a devastating impact on the lives of millions of children and parents worldwide. I'd like to say a few words about myself. I'm a child and family social worker and a social work professor who's worked with children and families in both Canada and the United Kingdom in various capacities for over 4 decades. Parenting after divorce and the needs of children of divorce has been my primary interest as a scientist and a family professional. In my research and writings, I've mainly examined the standpoint of family members, especially children, who are the most negatively affected by adversarial legal systems of family separation, those who've suffered from broken attachments and whose voice has rarely been heard. It's been largely ignored in research studies. Now, back in 1985, I embarked on a study of the impact of divorce on non-custodial parents and their children, and what happens to these relationships over time. This was my first major study in this area, and although the term parental alienation had not been invented at that time, I set out to study why so many of these parents lost contact with their children after separation and divorce. And now that I look back at it, mine was actually the first study to examine the phenomenon of what is now known as parental alienation. The results of my research were startling and completely contradicted what most people had assumed about non-custodial parents, especially fathers, who were labeled and discounted as deadbeat dads. Well, 4 main findings came out of that research back in 1985. I found, first of all, that non-custodial fathers experience a grief reaction containing all the elements of bereavement. And that bereavement, that deep sense of loss, was connected directly to the absence of their children, the loss of their role as a father, which for them was the main sort of role in their lives, and the constraints of the so-called access or visiting relationship. The second finding was really surprising, and that is that there's a discontinuity between pre- and post-divorce father-child relationships. I actually had expected that the most involved fathers would be the ones that were able to continue their relationship as non-custodial parents, and it was the less involved fathers who would lose contact. I actually found the opposite. And when I asked fathers themselves, what caused this? What's to blame for your loss of contact and for your disengagement from your children? They squarely put the blame on a legal system that did not recognize them as legitimate parents, that marginalized them, and that created an adversarial atmosphere that made it virtually impossible for any kind of negotiated outcome. And my final finding in that project in 1985 was that it's a combination of structural constraints, systemic constraints to fatherhood involvement, and fathers' own psychological reaction to the loss of their children on a full-time basis that led to their, what I called at that time, disengagement from their children. It's now known as parental alienation. Well, 20 years later, I decided to replicate that study. In the meantime, fathers were taking a much more active role in their children's lives. And I hypothesized that maybe the situation for fathers had improved. Well, I actually found, no, it hadn't improved. The system hadn't changed. And yet the fatherhood role had changed significantly. Fathers were now much more involved with their children's lives, much more attached, much more influential in the child's development. And rather than a grief reaction containing all the elements of bereavement, I found now, 20 years later, that fathers were experiencing a full-on post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of losing their children. And when I say losing, I'm talking about a system which doesn't grant access to one parent. It actually removes one parent from the life of a child by means of sole custody or primary residence orders. So the situation, far from improving for dads, actually became much, much worse. Now, since then, I've been among the first to study the impact of divorce on non-custodial mothers, and I found their reactions to be very similar, as more mothers now were becoming alienated from their children's lives. I've also studied grandparents who've been estranged from their grandchildren's lives. And I've studied children who've been robbed of the love and nurture of one of their parents. And of course, losing contact with half of their extended family as a result. I've also done a great deal of research on family mediation, and especially different approaches of family mediators, both an in-depth simulated client study looking at how family mediators operate, and also a survey on the working methods of family mediators. And of course, I've done, especially in the last 20 years, as the inaugural president of the International Council on Shared Parenting, and I've studied shared parenting and the degree to which shared parenting as a legal presumption is in the best interests of children. And now, in the last 5 years or so, I've returned to the topic of parental alienation as the main focus of my research. Now, those of us who've studied parental alienation appreciate all too well the importance of drawing attention to what's a very much neglected and highly misunderstood form of child abuse and also domestic violence. And as I say, although I began studying this phenomenon in 1985, at that time, the term parental alienation was not yet in use. And actually, the idea was so very controversial. So I used the more neutral language of parental disengagement. Now, I clarified that a little bit, and I referred to parental disengagement as an involuntary sort of estrangement. And that was met with a lot of pushback, a lot of resistance from people, professionals, as well as other researchers, who insisted that in fact, it was completely voluntary. And then it was parents' own fault if they lost contact with their children. Well, today, in 2022, I think it can finally be said that there's a widespread growing recognition of parental alienation as a serious social problem and the cause of a wide range of child and family pathologies. There's recognition of the reality of that parental alienation is both a serious form of child abuse as well as a type of family violence. But there's still less recognition that the problem is largely systemic in nature. Parental alienation and family violence flourish in jurisdictions where judges have the discretion to remove children from the custody of one of their parents and place the children in the almost exclusive care of one parent only. On the other hand, in those countries and states where shared parenting is established as the foundation of family law, parental alienation and family violence are much, much less of a problem. So the agenda for my talk today is straightforward. The first half will examine what is parental alienation and what makes it a form of both child abuse and family violence. The second half will examine strategies for combating and eliminating parental alienation, in which I'll outline a multifaceted 4-pillar approach to addressing the problem. These pillars consist of child protection, prevention, treatment, and legal interventions. We need a multifaceted approach, as parental alienation is a very complex social problem created largely by adversarial legal systems of family separation. And our solutions need to be both individual and systemic, both micro and macro level interventions. So I'll begin with looking at parental alienation as a form of child abuse and family violence. And the first point I'd like to make is that what makes parental alienation both a form of child abuse and family violence. The first point I'd make is that today parental alienation as a form of emotional abuse of children is at exactly the same level of public and professional awareness as child physical and sexual abuse was 1 century ago. For example, in North America at that time, those few people who were advocating for recognition of child physical abuse could only find allies for their cause of child protection within the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And in fact, child abuse intervention began as a subset of animal cruelty prevention. That's just how unaware people were of the issue. There was widespread denial and opposition to the concept of child physical abuse. And we see the same type of lack of awareness, denial, and opposition to parental alienation today, especially when family professionals who have little knowledge and training in the subject minimize its impact and extent. So I submit to you that as a form of emotional child abuse, parental alienation may be an even more extreme form of abuse of children than physical abuse for a number of reasons. It's now recognized that children witnessing the abuse of a parent is a particularly egregious form of child abuse, and parental alienation falls within that category. But more than simply witnessing parental abuse, parental alienation forces children to become complicit in that abuse. So parental alienation is emotional abuse, and we should not allow the challenges involved in proving emotional abuse of children to deter us from intervening in these cases. A parental alienation is a form of direct abuse of children and largely misunderstood and too often discounted by professional family practitioners in fields such as family law, child and family psychology, and child and family social work. But it's also a form of domestic violence. Just as it's said by some that those who suffer the most in war zones, refugee camps, and even death camps, as in World War II, they're not just the children, but they're the parents who witness the suffering of their children and are powerless to do anything about it. So it can be said that the parents of alienated children are the most acutely aware of the devastating effects of parental alienation on their children. Yet they're rendered powerless to act to protect their own children. When working with these parents, I bear witness to their quiet, often silent, heart-rending pleas, desperate for help for their children. Their voices have largely fallen on deaf ears. These aren't the parents that are out there agitating for their rights, as characterized by those who deny parental alienation. They're more the muted voices of those who suffer in quiet desperation. As a society, we stand passively by as research reports a suicide epidemic of alienated parents. We turn a blind eye also to the suffering of their children. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'd like to address the question, exactly how is parental alienation a form of child abuse? Well, first of all, it's important to define parental alienation and distinguish between parental alienation as a form of unjustified parental rejection by a child and justified parental rejection. So one very good definition of parental alienation is Jennifer Harman's definition, and that is the unjustified rejection of a parent by the child, in which children's views of the targeted parent are almost exclusively negative, to the point that the parent is demonized and seen as evil, resulting from a campaign of denigration or brainwashing by the other alienating parent, in which the child allies with the alienating parent. My own definition in my own publications is that parental alienation involves the programming of a child by one parent to denigrate the other targeted parent in an effort to undermine and interfere with the child's relationship with that parent. It does not refer to those cases where a child or parent has been victimized by child abuse or family violence, and the child is fearful of the parent as a result. And finally, the Parental Alienation Study Group defines it this way. The two main features of parental alienation are the child's unjustified rejection of and refusal of contact with the targeted parent, and the alienating parent's abusive strategies to denigrate the parent. Amy Baker goes further and identifies 5 main factors in the identification and diagnosis of parental alienation. All of these need to be present for parental alienation to occur. 1, the child refuses contact and expresses hatred or indifference toward the targeted, rejected parent. 2, there was a prior positive relationship between the child and the now rejected parent. 3, there's an absence of abuse or neglect or deficient parenting by the target parent. 4, there are multiple alienating behaviors by the alienating parent. And 5, there are behavioral manifestations in the child, denigration of the target parent, frivolous, weak, or untrue rationalizations, lack of ambivalence, absence of guilt, borrowed scenarios from the alienating parent, false statements based on false beliefs, based on false memories. The research of my colleague, Jennifer Harmon, tells us that parental alienation is far more common than previously believed. She sampled a representative poll of adults in the United States, found a startling rate of 13.4% of parents reporting that they've been alienated from one or more of their children by the other parent, with half of those reporting the alienation as severe. That percentage represents about 10.5 million parents in the US alone who are facing what they perceive to be parental alienation. But is parental alienation a form of child abuse? To answer this, we first must define child abuse and determine whether parental alienation fits within that definition. Now, child abuse is itself a contentious and a contested notion. But there is consensus that child abuse is a specific form of harm to children that has 2 core elements. First, its occurrence is attributable to human action or human agency. And second, it's a significant form of harm to children. Again, first, the abuse must be the result of human action, as opposed to neglect, which is the result of human inaction. This action may be either at the hands of an individual caregiver and or a form of collective action, for example, social, legal, political, and economic factors that directly harm children. Second, child abuse is a significant form of harm in that it poses a serious threat to the welfare and well-being of a child. In order for us to classify it as abuse, this significant harm must be unambiguous and clearly defined. Now, the 2 most commonly accepted definitions of child abuse include these 2 elements. So Cooper defined child abuse as a significant harm done or anticipated to a child as a result of human action. That action may be intentional or reckless and inflicted by individuals, groups, agencies, or the state. Finkelhorn and Corbin defined child abuse as the portion of harm that results from human actions that is prescribed, proximate, and preventable. Now, when we examine the definition of parental alienation, we see that it contains these 2 basic elements. First, it involves a set of abusive strategies on the part of a parent to foster the child's rejection of the other parent, whereby children are manipulated by one parent to hate the other. Second, its negative effects are extremely serious and debilitating to children. For the child, parental alienation is a significant mental disturbance based on a false belief that the alienated parent is a dangerous and unworthy parent. I'd like to look at these 2 elements in a little more depth. So the first defining feature of parental alienation as a form of child abuse is the behavior of the alienator. Well, we know that the tactics of alienating parents are tantamount to extreme psychological maltreatment of children: spurning, terrorizing, isolating, corrupting, exploiting, denying emotional responsiveness. Now, Amy Baker identifies 17 of these abusive strategies of alienating parents based on her research on adult children who lived through parental alienation. And the detection of parental alienation is a relatively straightforward matter. In regard to parental alienation, by their actions, you will know them. So the first strategy is just simply bad-mouthing. Bad-mouthing the target parent as unloving, unsafe, unavailable, flaws are exaggerated or manufactured. Statements are made frequently, intensely, with great sincerity. Another strategy is limiting contact. The target parent has few opportunities to counter the bad-mouthing message. Interfering with communication. Phones aren't answered. Email messages are blocked. Messages aren't forwarded. Interfering with symbolic communication. Thinking about, talking about, looking at pictures of a parent. The alienating parent creates an environment in which the child doesn't feel free to engage in those activities. The child's mind and heart are preoccupied with the alienating parent. There's no room left for the child's thoughts and feelings about the target parent. Withdrawal of love. What angers the alienating parent the most is the child's love and affection for the target parent. So the child has to relinquish the love of the other. The child lives in fear of losing the alienating parent's love and approval. Telling the child that the target parent is dangerous. Stories might be told about ways in which the target parent has tried to harm the child. Forcing the child to choose. The alienating parent will compel the child away from the target parent by scheduling competing activities and promising valued items and privileges. Telling the child that the target parent doesn't love him or her. The alienating parent will foster the belief in the child that he or she is being rejected by the target parent and distorts every situation to make it appear as if that's the case. Confiding in the child. The alienating parent will involve the child in discussions about legal matters, share with the child personal and private information about the target parent, will portray him or herself as the victim of the target parent, inducing the child to feel sorry for and protective of the alienating parent, and feel anger and hurt toward the target parent. These confidences are shared in a way as to flatter the child and appeal to the child's desire to be trusted and involved in adult matters. Forcing the child to reject the target parent. Alienating parents create situations in which the child actively rejects the target parent, such as calling the target parent to cancel upcoming parenting time or request that the target parent not attend an important school or athletic event. And once children have hurt a parent, the alienation will become entrenched as the child justifies their behavior by devaluing the target parent. Asking the child to spy on the target parent. Once children betray a parent by spying on them, they'll feel guilty and uncomfortable being around that parent, thus furthering the alienation. Asking the child to keep secrets from the target parent. The alienating parent will ask or hint that certain information should be withheld in order to protect the child's interests. Like spying, keeping secrets creates psychological distance between the target parent and the child. Referring to the target parent by first name rather than saying mommy, daddy, or your mommy or daddy, the alienating parent will use the first name of the target parent when talking about that parent to the child. And that might result in the child referring to the target parent by first name as well. The message to the child is the target parent is no longer someone whom the alienating parent respects as an authority figure for the child, and no longer someone who has a special bond with the child. By referring to the target parent by first name, the alienating parent is demoting that parent to the level of a peer or neighbor. Referring to a step parent as mom or dad and encouraging the child to do the same. So alienating parent will refer to the step-parent as a mother or father to the child and create the expectation the child will do so as well. Withholding medical, academic, and other important information from the target parent. Keeping the target parent's name off medical, academic, and other relevant documents. The target parent will be at a decided disadvantage in terms of accessing information, forging relationships, being contacted in emergencies, being invited to participate, being provided with changes in schedules, and so forth. That marginalizes the target parent in the eyes of the child and also in the eyes of others. The alienated parent makes it considerably more difficult for the target parent to be an active and involved parent. Changing the child's name to remove association with the target parent. The target parent may feel that the name change represents a rejection of him or her and will experience hurt, sadness, and frustration. And finally, cultivating dependency and undermining the authority of the target parent. Alienating parents develop dependency in their children rather than help their children develop self-sufficiency, critical thinking, autonomy, and independence. At the same time, they'll undermine the authority of the target parent in order to ensure that the child is loyal to only one parent. Now, when you look at these 17 strategies, you can see that each of these strategies serve to, first of all, further the child's cohesion and alignment with the alienating parent. Secondly, create psychological distance between the child and the target parent. Thirdly, intensify the target parent's anger and hurt over the child's behavior. And fourth, incite conflict between the child and the target parent, should the target parent challenge or react to the child's behavior. So these parents, alienating parents, convey a three-part message to the child. First of all, I'm the only parent who loves you, and you need me to feel good about yourself. Secondly, the other parent is dangerous and unavailable. And thirdly, pursuing a relationship with the other parent jeopardizes your relationship with me. Now, it's quite an exhaustive list of strategies that alienating parents use, but I would suggest that it's actually only a partial list because Baker's work is focused on the full range of parental alienation from mild to severe. It doesn't fully capture the most extreme forms of parental alienating behaviors. In my own research with alienated parents who have no contact with their children, some additional behaviors emerged. And I've identified a number of other abusive strategies of alienating parents in order of importance. First of all, seizing the child by force, including contact denial and misuse of the legal system to undermine the other parent's participation in the child's life, to remove that parent from the child's life. Secondly, alienating parents have a belief in their entitlement as the primary or sole parental figure in the child's life. And they exhibit a lack of validation, a lack of recognition of the importance of the other parent as a parent. Thirdly, there's insensitivity to and disregard of the impact of one's behavior on children. There's a lack of attunement to children's needs. There's a willingness to engage in conflict in front of the children. There's a lack of emotional depth and emotional responsiveness in the parent's relationship with their child. There's parentification of the child. Fourthly, alienating parents exhibit an overt or covert obsession with the other parent, an obsession with hurting the other parent to the extent that that obsession prevails over one's parental responsibilities. The parent's determination to hurt the parent overrides their love for their child and their parenting of their child. Fifth, there's a willingness and actually an enthusiasm to engage in adversarial combat. They're very skilled in the legal arena. There's a readiness to engage in and risk a winner-take-all process. Number 6 is a refusal to communicate. or engage in a negotiation process, either directly or with third-party interventions such as family mediation. And when they do become involved in mediation, there's a lack of good faith in any involvement in that kind of process. 7 is a refusal to accept responsibility for one's contribution to the problem situation or the conflict between the parents. There's an insistence on being right in all matters or disagreements with the former spouse. There's a lack of accountability in regard to the problem situation or conflict. 8, there's a readiness to accuse the other party of wrongdoing. They're quick to blame and place responsibility for the problem or conflict onto the other parent. 9, there's a lack of guilt or remorse for one's behavior, no regret over one's actions. 10 is exaggeration and dishonesty, an attitude of the end justifies the means. 11 is bad mouthing of the other parent in front of the child and avoiding any mention of the other parent in an attempt to erase that parent from the child's memory. And finally, monitoring and questioning the child in regard to the child's relationship with the other parent. Now, this list is actually, unlike Amy Baker's list, this one, Amy Baker focused on adult children who as children were alienated from their parent. This list of 12 strategies is based on my research with alienated parents. And as you go through this list, you'll notice some key characteristics of alienating parents in the most extreme cases of parental alienation. There's a sense of entitlement. There's an abuse of power. There's hatred of and desire to hate the other parent, which is stronger than the parent's love for the child. A lot of these behaviors are a sign of a parent's inability to separate from the couple conflict and focus on the needs of the child. Again, it's this obsession overriding the love for the child. These behaviors are a reflection of severe pathology in the alienating parent. Some psychodynamic theorists suggest that alienation is often born in complex trauma from the childhood of the alienating parent, and that the alienation process is a means of transferring onto the target parent that experience of complex trauma. The childhood trauma experience is what leads to the development of the aggression behind parental alienation. From a psychodynamic, from a psychodynamic perspective, the processes of parental alienation represent a reenactment of the childhood attachment trauma of the alienating parent into the current family relationships. The trauma reenactment narrative represents a false drama created by the pathology of the alienating parent, in which the target parent is being assigned the trauma reenactment role as the abusive parent. The child is being induced into accepting the trauma reenactment role as the supposedly victimized child, and the alienating parent adopts the role of the protective parent. But none of this false drama is true. The parenting of the target parent is entirely within normal range, and the child is in no danger and doesn't need protection from the alienating parent. So that's the first defining feature of parental alienation as a form of child abuse. The abusive strategies of the alienating parent. The second defining feature of parental alienation as a form of child abuse relates to the profoundly harmful effects on the child. This second manifestation of parental alienation is the child's unjustified campaign of denigration against the parent, in which the child's views of the target parent are almost exclusively negative, to the point that the parent is demonized and seen as evil. For the child, parental alienation is a serious mental condition based on a false belief that the alienated parent is dangerous and unworthy. So what are the effects of parental alienation on children? Well, first of all, in parental alienation situations, children lose the capacity to give and accept love from a parent. They're manipulated to hate the target parent, despite their innate desire to love and be loved by both their parents. And alienating parents' denigration results in the child's emotional rejection of the target parent and the loss of a capable and loving parent from the life of the child. Such emotional abuse is just as debilitating, often more so than physical or sexual abuse of children. It's a particularly harmful form of child abuse. The severe effects of parental alienation on children are now well documented. Low self-esteem and self-hatred, depression, social isolation, poor academic performance, substance abuse, and other forms of addiction and self-harm are widespread. And these harmful effects can be listed under four main categories. And I would say these are the four sort of categories of effects that are very well documented in the literature. First, self-hatred, a particularly disturbing phenomenon among affected children. It's one of the more serious effects of parental alienation or any form of child abuse. It's fairly common in situations of parental alienation, self-hatred. Teaching hatred of the other parent is tantamount to instilling self-hatred in the child. Children internalize the hatred targeted toward the alienated parent. They're led to believe that the alienated parent did not love or want them and experience severe guilt related to betraying the parent. Their self-hatred and depression is rooted in these feelings of being unloved by one of their parents and from separation from that parent while being denied the opportunity to mourn the loss of the parent or even talk about the parent. It's also rooted in the idea that children see themselves as half their mother and half their father. And if you hate one half of your parents, you're hating half of yourself. And we know that hatred is not an emotion that comes naturally to a child. It has to be taught. And a parent who teaches a child to hate or fear the other parent represents a grave and persistent danger to the mental and emotional health of the child. Second, alienated children also exhibit severe psychosocial disturbances due to parental alienation. These include disrupted social emotional development, a lack of trust in relationships, social anxiety, and social isolation. These kids have difficulties forming and maintaining relationships. They tend to discard people whenever they experience a negative reaction to them. They have a lack of tolerance for others. They have poor relationships with both of their parents. And as adults, they tend to enter partnerships earlier. They're more likely to divorce or dissolve their cohabiting unions. And they're more likely to have children outside any partnership and are more likely to become alienated from their own children. Third is low self-sufficiency, a lack of autonomy, and a lingering dependence on the alienated parent. Alienated children are at high risk of becoming psychologically vulnerable and dependent. They're more likely to play truant from school and leave school at an early age. They're less likely to attain academic and professional qualifications in adulthood. They're more likely to experience unemployment, have low incomes, and remain on social assistance. They seem to aimlessly drift through life. And fourth, alienated children experience difficulties controlling their impulses, and they struggle with addiction and self-harm. They're much more likely to smoke, drink alcohol, and abuse drugs, as well as succumb to behavioral addictions. They're more likely to be promiscuous, foregoing contraception, and becoming teenage parents. So parental alienation fits the definition of child abuse in that first, its occurrence is attributable to human actions, and secondly, it's a significant form of harm. And of the four different types of abuse, child abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect, parental alienation is usually considered to be a form of severe emotional or psychological abuse. But it also often co-occurs with the three other types of child abuse. neglect, because alienating parents' hatred of the target parent is stronger than their love for their child. They're less attuned to and thus neglect the needs of the child. And in regard to physical and sexual abuse, children in situations where one parent is absent from their lives are at significantly greater risk than children who have meaningful relationships with both parents. There is so much research on the effects of father absence in particular, but we also have some research on the effects of mother absence, and the effects are very similar. We no longer talk about the association between father absence and all of these pathologies in children. We now talk in terms of the causal effects of father absence. So, children from father absent homes are 5 times more likely to have experienced physical abuse and emotional maltreatment. They're exposed to a 100 times higher risk of fatal abuse. They have a higher risk of physical health problems, psychosomatic health symptoms, and illness such as acute and chronic pain, diabetes, asthma, headaches, stomach aches, and feeling sick. They run greater mortality and morbidity risks. They're more likely to die as children. They live an average of 4 years less over their lifespan. They're more likely to experience problems with sexual health and contracting sexually transmitted infections. And the Journal of Ethnology and Sociobiology reported that preschoolers who are alienated from one of their parents are 40 times more likely to be sexually abused. In addition to parental alienation being a form of child abuse, it's a form of family violence. And the effects of parental alienation on target parents can be severe and constitute a form of ongoing domestic violence perpetrated on them by the offending parent. Richard Gardner recognized this many years ago when he wrote, quote, "For some alienated parents, the continuous heartache is similar to a living death. Alienated parents live with anxiety, depression, and helplessness, as well as feelings of victimization by the other parent, the child, and all the systems, legal, mental health, and school systems that are not responsive to their needs. Parents wonder whether they'll ever get to see their child again. And under the current system in many states, in most cases, they won't see their child." We know from one research study that the highest levels of depression that occur among adults are those who have a child under age 18 with whom they're not living or actively involved. We also find in the literature that a suicide epidemic has been identified among non-resident alienated parents. Now, my own research from back in the 80s, and then again, from 1985, found that parents who lost all contact with their children following divorce suffered a grief reaction containing all the major elements of a bereavement. In my follow-up study 20 years later, I found that these parents are manifesting an even more pronounced reaction of post-traumatic stress, as they're acutely aware of the consequences of their absence in their children's lives. And this is probably the most hurtful thing of all, of witnessing the abuse of their children and being powerless to do anything about it. Now, there's still ongoing controversy surrounding parental alienation, but a professional consensus is emerging. But although parental alienation specialists have established that parental alienation is both a serious form of child abuse and family violence, there's still a lot of misinformation in the media and controversy within the professional community. But there is an emerging consensus that not only does it exist, it's much more widespread than we've assumed. And the harmful effects on children and alienated parents are much more pronounced than we've assumed. Now, this ongoing misunderstanding and in some quarters, even denial of parental alienation in the legal and mental health fields have prompted surveys of child and family practitioners. Can children actually reject a parent whose behavior doesn't warrant rejection? And if the answer is yes, can this rejection be due to the influence of an alienating parent? Well, back in 2014, there was a survey taken at the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts annual conference, which reported 98% agreement in support of the basic tenet of parental alienation, that children can be manipulated by one parent to reject the other parent who does not deserve to be rejected. Now, although parental alienation is not identified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, there are 3 disorders identified in the DSM that relate to parental alienation: parent-child relational problem, child affected by parental relationship distress, and child psychological abuse. Parental alienation as a parent-child relational problem involves 2 symptom clusters identified in the DSM: impaired functioning in behavioral, cognitive, or affective domains, and negative attributions of the other's intentions, hostility toward or scapegoating of the other, and unwarranted feelings of estrangement on the part of the child. So the concept of parental alienation is actually in the DSM, although the actual words parental alienation aren't there. However, parental alienation is in the current draft of the International Classification of Disorders, the World Health Organization's classification of diseases, with a specific definition of parental alienation in that document. So I'd now like to turn to the second half of my presentation: effective strategies for combating and eliminating parental alienation as a widespread social problem. The 4-pillar approach to addressing parental alienation that I'd like to propose is based on a few assumptions. First, I'm assuming that we agree that every child has a fundamental right and need for an unthreatened and loving relationship with both parents, and to be denied that right by one parent without sufficient justification, such as abuse or neglect, is a threat to children's well-being and emotional and physical security, and contrary to the best interests of children. Secondly, parental alienation is a serious form of emotional child abuse, which is strongly linked to child neglect and physical and sexual abuse. Alienated children are no less damaged than other child victims of extreme conflict, such as child soldiers or abducted children who identify with their tormentors to avoid pain and maintain a relationship with them, however abusive that relationship may be. That results in a wide range of negative physical and mental health effects on children. Thirdly, parental alienation is also a serious form of domestic violence, and parents also have a fundamental right and need for an unthreatened and loving relationship with their children, and to be denied that right by the other parent without sufficient justifications, such as abuse or neglect, is a threat to parental well-being and mental health. Fourthly, a child-focused approach to addressing parental alienation in both the legal and mental health fields is the best way to ensure that children's interests are addressed to the fullest extent possible. This requires both an understanding of children's fundamental needs and a corresponding set of parental and societal responsibilities to those needs. And this kind of has been my mantra for years. It's the responsibility of social institutions, such as the courts, for example, to support parents in the fulfillment of their parental responsibilities to their children's needs, to support them, not undermine them. And finally, the 2 key factors, and I think there's very little debate about this. The 2 key factors in children's adjustment to the consequences of divorce are: 1, the maintenance of meaningful relationships, loving relationships with both parents. There's a clear linear relationship between the amount of shared parenting time and good outcomes for children. And 2, a key factor in children's adjustment is being shielded from ongoing parental conflict and family violence. Now, this framework I'm going to propose to you today is intended to serve as a template for legislators, policymakers, and practitioners to address the problem of parental alienation. Although there's no quick fix, there's no panacea in regard to addressing the complex issue of parental alienation, I would suggest that a multifaceted approach combining both macro and micro level interventions, structural changes, as well as individualized responses offer the best opportunity for reducing, if not eliminating, parental alienation in the best interests of children and families. The framework builds upon what we know from the over 1,000 clinical and empirical studies on the subject of parental alienation over the past couple of decades. It also rests on this wide body of research on shared parenting as in the best interests of children after separation and divorce. So, as I've mentioned, I'm proposing a four-pillar or four-staged approach to addressing parental alienation, consisting of child protection, number one, which involves directly addressing parental alienation as a form of child abuse and as a child protection matter. Secondly, prevention, which involves the establishment of a rebuttable legal presumption of shared parental responsibility. Thirdly, treatment, which includes both parent-child reunification programs where alienation has taken hold, and a wide range of therapeutic services for alienated parents and children. And fourthly, legal interventions, which involves addressing parental alienation as a form of domestic violence and as a criminal matter. So I'd like to look at each of these in turn. First, the child protection pillar. The first step in combating parental alienation is the recognition by child protection authorities of parental alienation as a form of individual child abuse that warrants a child protection response. Parental alienation is a serious form of emotional child abuse, which is linked to child neglect and to physical and sexual abuse, clearly makes it, above everything else, a child protection concern. Yet professional misunderstanding of and indifference by professional service providers, especially child protection authorities, to alienation reports is widespread. And in many jurisdictions, child emotional abuse in general is rarely even investigated by child protection authorities. Effective child protection responses to parental alienation as a form of individual child abuse is a priority. These responses include a thorough investigation and assessment of parental alienation, family support and family preservation programs where children remain with both parents, with parenting support from family service workers, as well as child removal, where children are apprehended from alienating parent in the more extreme cases in order to allow the child to reestablish a relationship with the targeted parent. Family support services aimed at educating parents about the effects and unacceptability of alienation and effecting a reunification process between the child and the target parent will be the preferred intervention in most situations of less extreme alienation. When the alienating parent takes responsibility for the abuse and is productively engaged in a reunification program between the child and the target parent, an educative family preservation approach is indicated. When children grow up in an atmosphere of parental alienation, their primary role model is a maladaptive, dysfunctional parent. It's important for child protection workers working with alienating parents to emphasize that responsible parenting involves respecting the other parent's role in the child's life, and that any form of denigration of a co-parent is harmful to children. It should also be made clear that poisoning children's minds and instilling hatred toward a parent are serious forms of abuse. Children's connections to each parent must be respected to ensure their well-being. Alienating parents are themselves emotionally fragile, often enmeshed with the child, with a sense of entitlement, needing to maintain control. They pose significant clinical challenges, but in most cases, they'll be best served by family support services and not child removal. But child removal or custody reversal may be necessary in more extreme cases of parental alienation, or at least a period of separation between the child and the alienating parent during the reunification process with the targeted parent. Changes in custodial or residential arrangements in favor of the target parent are most effective in ameliorating serious forms of parental alienation. Leaving a child with the alienating parent or waiting for the spontaneous resolution of parental alienation, or letting the child decide custody or residential arrangements are strategies to be avoided in alienation cases. Leaving the target child in the primary care of the alienating parent enables the alienation to continue and become more severe, with more severe consequences, further damage to the target parent-child relationship, and negative psychological and social outcomes for the targeted child. In extreme alienation cases, leaving the child with the alienating parent exacerbates the alienation, and removing the child from the alienating parent and placement with the target parent is the most effective child protection strategy. Changing custody in favor of the target parent can reduce and even ameliorate parental alienation. The degree of change in residential arrangements depends on the severity of the alienation, and therapeutic support to all family members during that transition is vital. Now, the second pillar to addressing parental alienation is that of prevention. The second step in combating parental alienation is the recognition by family law authorities that the current adversarial winner-take-all framework promotes and intensifies parental conflict, which dramatically increases the prevalence of parental alienation. Parental alienation as a form of child abuse is thus not only the result of the individual actions of a parent, but its source is also found in outdated social and legal policies and family law. Parental alienation, much more likely to occur in jurisdiction where child residence is granted by the court to one parent only. Parental alienation flourishes in situations where one parent has legal care and control of children. And legal systems that remove a parent from a child's life by means of sole custody or primary residence orders are not only contributing to parental alienation, they're engaging in parental alienation as a form of collective child abuse. There's no great mystery about parental alienation. If we legally sanction parental alienation, the risk of parental abuse increases. It's in the context of legally determined primary residence arrangements that parental alienation flourishes. It thrives also in an adversarial system, a winner-take-all system, where parents are forced to denigrate each other as parents as much as possible to prove that there's the superior parent and they're more worthy of being granted sole custody or primary residence of children. Parents are set up to fight in an effort to win, to obtain custody of their children. The system tends to reward those who are skilled in adversarial combat. Parents often win their case by disparaging the other parent as a parent, in effect engaging in alienating behaviors, and the system encourages and produces alienating behavior. On the other hand, parental alienation is least likely to occur in jurisdictions which have legislated a presumption of shared parenting. Shared parenting law, a legal sanctioning of the fact that children have two primary parents, is a bulwark against parental alienation. So the second step in combating parental alienation as a form of collective child abuse involves a fundamental reform of the family law system. Specifically, a rebuttable legal presumption of shared parenting is needed to prevent parental alienation from occurring in the first place. And in all my years of interviewing parents, especially non-resident parents, this is the most important pillar toward addressing the problem of parental alienation. The vast majority of parents support a legal presumption as in the best interests of children as well as parents themselves. I could spend this entire presentation discussing the finer points of a legal presumption of shared parenting. And I've made many presentations on that topic. But most simply stated, the most effective way to combat parental alienation is the establishment of a legal presumption of not only shared parenting, but equal parenting, with children spending equal amounts of time in each parent's household, where both parents are legally responsible for their children, equally responsible for their children. The closer to 50% the time division, the better the outcomes for children. That is well established in research. Now, this presumption would be rebuttable in cases where it's established that a child is in need of protection from a parent via an investigated finding that child abuse is an issue of concern or a criminal conviction of family violence. Treatment is the third pillar. Now, intervention in cases of parental alienation, a very sensitive matter. Reunification efforts should be undertaken with professionals with specialized expertise in parental alienation reunification. A number of models have been developed, a number of intervention models, the best known being Richard Warshak's Family Bridges program, which is an educative and experiential program focused on allowing the child to have a healthy relationship with both parents, removing the child from the parental conflict, and encouraging child autonomy, multiple perspective taking, and critical thinking. Sullivan's Overcoming Barriers Family Camp combines psychoeducational and clinical intervention within an environment of milieu therapy and is aimed toward the development of an agreement regarding the sharing of parenting time and a written aftercare plan. Friedlander and Walter's multimodal family intervention provides differential interventions for situations of parental alignment, alienation, enmeshment, and estrangement. All of these programs emphasize the clinical significance of children coming to regard their parents as equally important and equally valued in their lives, while at the same time helping enmeshed children relinquish their protective role toward their alienating parent. Alienated children seem to have a secret wish for someone to call their bluff, to compel them to reconnect with the parent they claim to hate. Despite strongly held positions of alignment, alienated children want nothing more than to be given the permission and freedom to love and be loved by both parents. And research has shown that many alienated children can transform quickly from refusing or staunchly resisting the rejected parent to being able to show and receive love from that parent. But that can be followed by an equally swift shift back to the alienated position when back in the orbit of the alienating parent. So, while children's stated wishes regarding parenting arrangements in contested custody cases should be considered, they should not be determinative in cases of parental alienation. There's a big disconnect between what children say they want and what they truly desire. I hear from many alienated parents, both fathers and mothers, and the main message I give them is never give up. I tell them, in the face of hostility and rejection from your children, always respond with loving compassion, emotional availability, and absolute safety. Patience, hope, unconditional love, being there for your child is the best response you can provide your children, even in the face of the sad truth that may not be enough to bring back your child. I agree with Richard Warshak when he says that wherever possible, alienated parents should try to expose their children to people who regard them with honor and respect, especially as parents, to let children see that their negative opinion and the opinion of the alienating parent isn't shared by the rest of the world. That kind of experience will leave a stronger impression than anything that the alienated parent can say on his or her own behalf. And finally, legal intervention is the fourth and final pillar. Parental alienation is also a form of family violence. And family violence is a criminal matter and should be addressed as such in the criminal court, not adjudicated in the family court. But there is a role for the family law system to play, and that's the enforcement of shared parenting orders. Enforcement is made a lot easier when neither parent is threatened by the potential loss of his or her children, and enforcement of shared and equal parenting orders are much easier than the law enforcement nightmare we have when one parent is excluded from a child's life by means of primary residence orders. So in conclusion, parental alienation is a specific form of abuse to children with two core elements. First, it constitutes a significant kind of harm to children, tantamount to other forms of child maltreatment. And second, its occurrence may be attributed to human agency on both an individual and collective level. The current state of knowledge is such that the severe effects of parental alienation on children are well documented, as is responsibility for that harm at both individual and collective levels, meaning the actions of alienating parents and the social structures that encourage and maintain those kinds of behaviors. Of the general types of child abuse, parental alienation is a form of emotional abuse with profound consequences and includes children witnessing the abuse of a parent and colluding in that abuse. It also often co-occurs with both neglect and with physical and sexual abuse, given that children raised in father-absent or mother-absent homes are at significantly higher risk of all three of these forms of maltreatment. As a form of child abuse with an individual caregiver at its source, parental alienation is a child protection issue. As it's also a form of child maltreatment with collective abuse as its source, parental alienation is an issue that has to be dealt with on a broader structural level, requiring fundamental reform of the family law system. So we find ourselves truly at a crossroads in that with over 1,000 studies, we have ample data in regard to the serious harms of parental alienation, the prevalence of parental alienation, and the urgent need to take immediate action. If there's one recommendation I would make, it's this, and I leave you with this final thought. The true measure of a nation's standing is how well it attends to its children, their health and safety, their material security, their education and socialization, and their sense of being loved, valued, and included in the families and societies into which they were born. Shared parenting is the most effective way, a most effective method of prevention and intervention to address parental alienation as a form of child abuse and family violence, and is commensurate with the well-being and the best interests of children and their families. I'll end on that note, and thank you for your participation today.